At 4ZZZ, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we broadcast. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging of the Turrbal and Jagera people. We acknowledge that their sovereignty over this land was never ceded.
And we stand in solidarity with them.
You're listening to Tranzmission on 4ZZZ, amplifying the trans and gender non-conforming voices of Brisbane and beyond.
You're listening to Tranzmission with Brody. My pronouns are they, them.
And Bette, my pronouns are she, they. My microphone seems to be very slowly drifting down on this stand.
It's just drifting down. Like my awakeness is...
Really? Your awakeness is bottoming out at the moment?
It is. It's the morning. It's 9 a.m.
Yeah, it's a bit rough.
It is. I'm used to being here at 9 p.m. usually. So it's a bit different.
I apologise for calling you out at this ungodly hour.
No worries. It's okay. It's lovely to be here filling in for Tranzmission today. And today on the show, Bette and I are going to be discussing some things Bette's very passionate about.
Yeah, well, I thought we could call this show maybe the D word.
The D word. I like that. I like that a lot.
I'm so goddamn sick of hearing this word, detransition. So today, I thought we could talk about how to talk about detransition, because I feel like the way that we all talk about it is not all that constructive. And even better, how not to talk about detransition. Does that sound?
That sounds amazing.
Cool. Well, now, Brody, what kind of... Are you in the mood for a big info dump before...
Yes, please. I love a good info dump in the morning.
Okay. Well, you do. That sounds unlikely. Okay, the first thing I want to say is just the thing I always say whenever I mention the D word on this show, and that is please try and use scare quotes when you mention this word in an advocacy context or a scientific context. Now, I've faced up to the fact that a lot of us just use it kind of as a slang term or just, like the way we use transition. We're not usually citing statistics about transition because transition also doesn't really have a strict definition. But for some reason, a lot of us seem to want to cite these exact statistics about so-called detransition without actually defining what it means. And that includes people doing scientific studies too. A lot of the studies use different definitions, or else they don't even use the term detransition at all. But then folks, mostly on the other side of the argument, the anti-trans brigade, take them out of context. But to be honest, we often take them out of context too on our side of the argument. So I've got a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. One is the infamous study. It's Roberts et al. 2022. This one is always quoted by anti-trans folks. And it was a study of mostly young people using their parents' military healthcare to access gender-affirming medical hormones. And 30% of these young people, or of people in the study, stopped accessing care through this system. But the thing is, we don't know anything else about those people. We don't know if they got care elsewhere. We don't know why they stopped accessing care. And also, this was entirely based on a secondary analysis of records from the US military healthcare system. So it can only tell us that one thing, that people stopped accessing care. So that doesn't really equate with detransition in my mind, right? At the other extreme is Bustos et al. 2021. We all cite this all the time. It's a systematic review that found a 1% regret rate for gender-affirming surgeries for trans folks. You might have heard of it. So a systematic review looks at a lot of studies and kind of weighs them up and averages them out and whatever. Oh my God. Someone's just texted me and I've moved away from my notes.
That is okay.
Yeah, so the 1% detransition study, firstly, obviously, surgery is not the same thing as transition, and regretting surgery is not the same as detransition. So when we cite that statistic as if it's got something to do with transition or with gender-affirming medical care in general, I've heard it cited in that way, that there's a 1% regret rate for gender-affirming care. Now, gender-affirming care even includes psychological visits. So,
it can mean so many different things. It's not just that part.
Yeah. So I guess, we can cite that study, but we need to be specific about what it was really about, right? And it was not in any form about so-called detransition. And there's one other caveat with that study, which is that most of the studies that it looked at were looking at patients returning to their surgeons to express dissatisfaction. But we don't always go and tell our surgeons if we're unsatisfied, mostly because they're probably going to charge us to go in there and say
exactly.
that, right? So there is another study I think is more relevant than both of them, and then I'll stop citing studies at you. This one, I'm not sure how to pronounce this person's name, Cavve et al., I'm going to say, 2024. It's more well known as the West Australian Pediatric Gender Clinic Study. So it's called Re-Identification with Birth-Registered Sex in a Western Australian Pediatric Gender Clinic Cohort. Try saying that with a mouthful of spaghetti.
Yes, honestly.
So for a start, I prefer re-identification with presumed gender at birth, or just presumed gender. So I'm going to talk about that from now on. But I do think this is a relevant statistic to cite, though, right? Like, most of us, I think, on the advocacy side, generally think of that when we think of so-called detransition, I think, if we're citing it in this context. So this study found that of a cohort of 548 young people, 5.3% of them re-identified as their presumed gender before or during assessment. But that included some young people who had not yet started hormones. So they would be called, even by the anti-trans side, they would generally be referred to as so-called desisters, not detransitioners. There's a distinction there. So a desister is generally someone who hasn't yet started medication, but they have identified as trans, but then they change their mind. So again, another word that you should never use. But only 2 of these young people re-identified as their presumed gender during or following medical treatment. So those are the ones that we could maybe call quote-unquote detransitioners, and that equates to 1% of all patients. There is a caveat. We don't know how long any of these patients accessed hormones before they left the clinic. So they may well have stopped hormones later on. We have no idea. And I do think it's fair that if we are going to get into this argument, it makes a difference whether we're looking at these young people for a year or 10 years. Do you know what I mean? So there is that caveat. I still think it's a great study, but even the study itself says that, and I'm quoting now, longitudinal follow-up studies, including qualitative self-report, are needed to understand different pathways of the gender identity experience.
Right.
Okay.
So I have many thoughts, and trying to process them into words, and it's difficult because I have many thoughts about those kind of studies and how, like, the data of it and, like, the specifics of who are these people, there's so many questions that I have.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, just to mention the Cass review again, the Cass review was infamous for mostly ignoring qualitative data rather than quantitative data, and I think that what you're yearning for is probably more qualitative data that actually interviews patients or gets them to fill out some sort of questionnaire, and we find out how they're feeling about the process.
Can you tell I'm coming from, like, my histories in like social work, peer work, that kind of stuff, because that's where my brain instantly goes. Because it's like, have the conversations and talk,
Yeah, totally.
That's where my background's coming from.
Well, and all 3 studies that I just cited were based on analysing the records at a certain medical facility, right? The systematic review was based on analysing other studies, many of which were based on analysing the records at a medical clinic. So, it's very removed from the human being. So I said that usually people on the advocacy side, when we're defining detransition, quote unquote, that we usually will equate it with re-identification with presumed gender. And that's what I used to do until very recently, until the last time I was on air. And then I've been thinking about it recently, and I've been like, hang on, if we're going to discuss this word, is this the best definition to use? I thought so, but now I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So there's a study that I've mentioned before. It's like a systematic review. It's a retrospective study of other studies. It's by a trans woman. Her name is Lexi Henny. Now, she's posted this as a Medium blog, like a Medium post. It's not peer-reviewed, so we can't really cite it. But it's very convincing. She works for NASA, actually. She's not a physician.
Cool.
And she comes up with a roughly 2 to 3% rate of so-called detransition. And her definition is the intentional cessation of gender-affirming medical care or reversal of social transition. And then she adds, where possible, this will be restricted to cases motivated by gender identity, meaning that they re-identified with their presumed gender. So lately I've decided I think I like the first part of that definition, but not the second. And the reason why is because I think detransition should mean the opposite of transition, right?
Yeah.
And when we transition, we don't change, we don't start out in our presumed gender and go, oh, but I want to transition, even though I'm cisgender.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
We actually we have a realization about our gender first, and many would say that our gender was the same since we were born, right?
Yeah.
And then we transition in order to affirm that gender. So if we're going to detransition, I think we should be unaffirming that gender, changing back whatever changes we made or attempting to, reversing our social transition, but not going back to our gender presumed at birth, because that is not the reverse of transition. But having said that, that's not a statistic. That's not a definition I'm going to be talking about in advocacy space, because I don't actually think it's very helpful. Yeah. And that's why I don't think the word's very helpful.
Yeah.
And I guess one other thing I just wanted to say on that, and then maybe we can play some music, is if you don't agree with me at first listen, consider this. It's common for people on our side in the advocacy space to claim that because of bans on gender-affirming medical care, say in the United States or the UK, that trans young people are being forcibly detransitioned.
Yeah.
So if you think about that and you unpack that, how could denying a young person HRT cause them to re-identify with their presumed gender? Like, if you think that the definition of detransition is re-identification with birth gender, and yet on the other hand, you think that kids are being forcibly detransitioned if you take their medication away. What you're basically saying is that you can detrans a kid by taking away their medication. You can make them re-identify with their presumed gender at birth. And that is basically what the other side wants everyone to believe. That's a slippery slope argument we should not go down.
I agree.
The thing is that the same advocate will use these different definitions in different conversations. So the same advocate will insist that, no, this statistic is the right one, this 1% statistic, because that involves re-identification with presumed gender. But on the other hand, you're forcibly detransitioning kids by taking away their medication. So I just think all of that is totally confusing.
Yeah, it really is.
We don't want to confuse people, because if we confuse people on this issue, we're basically doing the other side's job for them, because all they need to do is generate a significant amount of doubt, and it's all over for trans kids.
Exactly.
So let's play some music.
Yes.
That's my info dump for now.
I love a good info dump from Bette.
Amplifying the voices of the trans and gender non-conforming community of Meanjin, Brisbane and beyond.
Transmission on 4ZZZ brings you the latest in trans community news, music and events.
Every Tuesday from 9am till 10am.
Join our team of hosts for an hour of celebrating the unique perspectives of the trans community.
Transmission, Tuesday mornings from 9am till 10am on 4ZZZ.
My name is Bette, pronouns she, they, and you're listening to Transmission.
And my name is Brody, and my pronouns are they, them.
I'm going to jump back into the info dump, if you don't mind.
Please do.
It's one of those episodes, people. So we're talking about the D word, so-called detransition. It's chaotic in here today.
Chaos. Chaos.
Now, as I said before, I'm generally not going to advocate for trans young people by discussing how many of them cease gender-affirming medical care or reverse their social transitions, even though I think that that's probably the most sensible definition of the word detransition. And the reason why I'm not going to do that is because most young people who do reverse their social transitions or cease gender-affirming medical care seem to do that for reasons of minority stress, because they can't get a job, or their parents don't approve, or their friends bully them, or they get harassed in the street. So for the same reason, I'm not usually going to talk about regret, because after all, you could regret your transition for all of those reasons too. You could regret your transition because of minority stress. It doesn't mean you're quote-unquote not really trans if you regret transitioning. Maybe it just means that society is cruel to trans people, right? And in which case, the answer would not be to deny trans people care. It would be to fix society. So while I don't think that the other metric, re-identification with presumed gender, is a good definition of detransition, I think it might be the most meaningful metric to cite when anti-trans campaigners start discussing detransition. So I guess my advice would be, if you get into an argument with someone about so-called detransition, the first thing you should do is ask them what definition they're using. Then ask them to cite what study that they're thinking of when they're citing statistics at you. Chances are they won't be able to cite a study at all, and if they do, the definition used in the study won't match the definition that they're using. But meanwhile, I suggest don't get drawn into discussing what you think the detransition rates are. What you could do is cite the Western Australian study, emphasise that it deals with a more meaningful metric than so-called detransition, and that is re-identification with presumed gender, aka birth-registered sex. But one thing I wanted to say is the way that we, even as advocates, often cite these studies kind of troubles me, because we act as though they're ironclad. So I noticed that even... So I mean, my advice would be, don't say that the rate of re-identification with presumed gender among young people accessing gender-affirming medical care is 1%. Because there's only one study that's telling us that.
Exactly,
So, and definitely don't say the so-called detransition rate is 1%. You have to spell it all out and say that this particular study led to this particular outcome. Put it in context. There's a lot more words in that claim, but it's more accurate. And like I said, we don't really want to generate confusion.
Exactly.
Which relates to something that frustrates me, which I'm calling the meme-ification of science.
Please tell me about the meme-ification of science.
Well, look, it's not a full-blown theory or anything yet, but I've just noticed, I mean, recently, earlier this year, I think it was, I noticed everyone reposting, and this includes trans advocacy groups, reposting a little meme-like graphic that said that the detransition rate was 1%. Didn't say anything else. Didn't have a footnote, didn't cite any studies. It was just that. And I noticed that after that, everyone was citing this all the time, and I'm like,
where's the research? Where's the, appropriate reflection upon what you're reposting, what you're sharing
and how are you going to operate? Like, if you go into a debate with someone and that's all you've got, like a meme.
Be like, here, this is my information. These are my resources. Yeah, it's not helpful, and it's detrimental, really. Like,
I think so.
Yeah.
And I think that debate's going to be over pretty quickly. It's just going to degenerate into a shouting match where you're going, it's 1%, and they're going, it's 30%. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But having said that, I did just want to cite one example of this. I guess I'm going to mention who it was. It's a prominent Australian trans advocacy org, Transcend. We all know them. Now, they have a very helpful document called the Detransition Evidence Brief, and it says all the right things, all the things that I've been saying. It says that detransition, unquote, and desistance are poorly and inconsistently defined. Tick. It says that regret doesn't equal re-identification with presumed gender, although they use the term birth-registered sex, that I don't like quite so much. They reference the so-called 80% desistance myth. So I did a whole podcast on that, if you want to look it up. That is the basis of a lot of our troubles. They cite the same Western Australian study, and they pull apart the Cass review, and I'm like totally on board for all that. But then at the end, they summarise their conclusions with 4 bullet points under the heading summary, I think it is. And you just know that a lot of people are going to skim the body of the text and just look at the bullet points. And the first bullet point says, re-identification with birth-registered sex is uncommon. Approximately 5% of adolescents who seek specialist gender-affirming healthcare ever re-identify, and 1% of people who begin medical treatments, e.g. puberty suppression and hormone therapy, ever re-identify. And I feel like that ever in there, ever re-identify is quite a leap.
Yeah.
They're basing that on one study.
One study, yeah.
And I see this so much, and you see it, I mean, I'm sure we've all noticed it when people on the right post their wacky newspaper articles, anti-trans blogs or whatever. The headline will always say something completely outrageous, but then when you read the body of the actual text, it usually doesn't actually say what's in the headline. And I feel like this is exactly the same thing, but we're doing it,
Exactly,
right?
yeah. It's using the headlines, using the dot points, I guess, to summarize it, but those points aren't the most powerful.
And they're not even accurate.
Yeah, exactly. And providing inaccurate information, and that's harmful in itself because...
Yeah.
Like, we know the world we live in, and people aren't going to go through, like, unless you're like me and Bette, and we'll go through and read the whole review and pick it apart. But people aren't going to read the whole review, and they're just going to skim over it and read the points at the top, the introduction, the summary, whatever. So we need to be able to focus on those kind of things.
And there was one other example of that, and then I might stop info dumping quite so much, where... So you probably saw this. It just cropped up all over my social media. So trans journalist Erin Reed, American trans journalist, I love her. She makes a kind of a similar leap in her recent article on the 2022 US transgender survey. And this popped up. Advocacy orgs on Facebook were citing it. We even cited it here on Tranzmission last week. The article is called Largest Trans Survey Ever. Top reason trans people stop transitioning is transphobia, and read quotes from a report that was written based on the survey. And it says that only 4% of people who went back to living in their sex assigned at birth for a while, because a lot of them retransitioned a few times, only 4% cited that their reason was because they realised that gender transition was not for them. When considering all the respondents who had transitioned, this number equates to only 0.36%.
Right.
So really that's a 0.36% rate of people re-identifying with their presumed gender.
Yeah. And there can be so many contributing factors to that little, like, you know what I mean? Like, there's so many things.
Well, the problem that I'm picking up, and I don't know how many other people picked it up, but I saw some people on Reddit did.
Of course.
I'm going to read something I found on the survey website and see if you can guess what the problem is. It says, the 2022 US Transgender Survey was an anonymous online survey for binary and non-binary trans people aged 16 and older in the United States.
Right, okay, so many thoughts.
Well, my first thought is the survey is for trans people, but we're using it to cite how many people don't identify as trans anymore. Well,
that's not helpful. Like, that is... Oh my gosh.
Now the thing is, before someone rings in and they're angry, or they text and they're angry or something, I'm not saying that those people were excluded from the survey, because they weren't, and that 0.43% reflects that they weren't actually excluded. I looked at the survey, and I think it was question 5 or 6, said something like, have you ever identified as a gender that did not align with your sex assigned at birth? So that could cover someone who had re-identified, because it's only asking if they'd ever felt that they were trans, right? But the thing is that firstly they had to get through the other opening questions to get there, and the first question is, are you trans or non-binary, or something like that. But also the website for the survey says that the survey was promoted via LGBTQIA plus centres and advocacy groups and online in LGBTQIA plus spaces. So there's a good chance that if someone had re-identified as their presumed gender and they didn't want anything to do with the queer community anymore, they didn't even know the survey was on. And I also watched some videos that were put out at the time advertising the survey to try and get people to answer it, and they did a great job, because it's the biggest survey ever on this topic with something like 80,000 respondents. But none of those videos mentioned that it was open to people who identified as detransitioners or who didn't identify as trans anymore. So, in my mind, that's a pretty serious risk of bias.
It is.
And the thing is, I'm not saying the whole survey has a high risk of bias, because there's plenty of other great metrics that the survey covers. And I wish that we were focusing more on them. Like, the survey shows that the difference in mental health between people
Yep. 100%,
pre-medicalized transition
yeah.
and post is dramatic, you know. We could have just cited that, but instead we're all focusing on the very thing that the survey is least able to answer. So that frustrated the hell out of me.
It frustrates me too, don't worry. It's coming from, there's so many contributing factors to these kind of things, and if they focus on that one thing, as I said before, it is going to take it out of context. It's not going to provide an accurate description of what the study is and the results from the study. And that frustrates me. Yeah,
and when they frame it that way, it makes it seem like the study was set up to discover that.
Yep.
But it wasn't. That was just one of many questions, like hundreds of questions that were in there.
Oh, we love it.
And the thing is, I'm not even saying that the statistic is wrong. I mean, like, I'm guessing maybe in line with Lexi Henny that the real statistic might have been 2 to 3% of people who re-identify.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if we're going around citing that statistic as if it's ironclad, as if it's legitimate, even I'm not even sure how legitimate it is.
Yeah.
The other side is just going to completely, again, they're going to immediately generate confusion from that, and it's going to be counterproductive. So, that's my info dump. And as I thought, we're very near the end of the show.
One more info dump done.
I did want to mention 2 people who might be worth looking into if you're interested in this topic. The first is quite controversial. His name is Kinnon MacKinnon. He's a trans man. I think he's quite hated by some members of the trans community. But I saw that Julia Serrano cited him without criticism. So I'm like, well, Julia Serrano's pretty credible. So I think he might be worth looking more closely at. He does studies on the causes of so-called detransition. So he gets in touch with so-called detransitioners, most of whom, maybe all of whom, identify as detransitioners. So it's the correct word in that context. If you're interested in that topic, I think it's worth looking at. I wouldn't be citing him in advocacy spaces probably again, because I think there are some problems with Kinnon MacKinnon, but anyway. And the other one, who I find more interesting, is Kai Schevers. I don't know if I'm saying that right. She identifies as transmasc but uses she/her pronouns for now, although she says that she may
I know Kai,
change. Right, yeah, so Kai used to be... Oh, okay, this is the same Kai who was a famous detransitioner or infamous detransitioner?
It's a very interesting context, and I think it's the same person,
So I read a couple of Kai's articles, and they're interesting. I think that they're worth looking at. She writes about so-called detrans communities, which are usually led by so-called radical or second-wave feminists, and they're super anti-trans. They treat transition like a drug addiction. They use language taken from Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12-step program, kind of like one day at a time you're resisting being trans. Do you know what I mean? And Schevers compares it to the ex-gay movement of the 1980s and 90s, and she points out that there's not really any welcoming spaces for so-called detransitioners to go to once they cease gender-affirming medical care and cease identifying as queer. There's not much support for them, and they end up in these transphobic communities. But the problem is that the people invested in these transphobic ideologies have no interest in helping them, because it's better if they keep them angry about what happened to them, because then they can use them in the media and, to further their anti-trans narrative.
Is this the same person?
No.
Okay.
No.
I was mistaken, sorry.
It's Kai, K-Y, Schevers, Schevers.
Okay. I was mistaken. My apologies.
You're right. It would have been interesting if you did know her.
Yeah, I was going to say. Doesn't sound like the one I know.
No, and she calls all of this ideologically motivated detransition.
That's an interesting,
And the reason why I bring it up is it's not strictly relevant to what I've been talking about, but again, I think when we use this word, detransition, we're inadvertently feeding into things like this, feeding into an actual ideology that equates being trans with addiction, and that uses a 12-step program-like framework to try and convince people that they aren't trans anymore.
And that's harmful. That's like so harmful. Oh my gosh.
And then this is weaponized by these groups who like Kai Schevers became a prominent anti-trans campaigner by getting involved in one of these groups, getting trained up by these second wave feminists, and then being sent out in the world to tell her story. And it was the Keira Bell case in the UK that ended up where we are now with the Cass review and the ban on hormones in the UK, that convinced Kai Schevers that actually she didn't want anything to do with this anymore. She didn't want to harm trans people's lives. And now she's kind of in this in-between state with her gender, not quite sure where she stands, but she doesn't want anything to do with those people anymore.
It's very interesting, how people use it as, frame it as an addiction, that kind of stuff, when it's not. It's
amazing.
It's honestly beyond messed up, and I have no words.
Well, you can imagine them all like in their camp, like sitting around in this circle talking about, I thought about wanting to be a man again today or something like that, and the lead TERF would be saying, it's okay, one day at a time, you'll
with
stamp
styrofoam
this.
cups in hand as well, so it's
Yeah.
there's so many, it's such an interesting concept, and thinking about it from like a lived experience perspective, that I'm sure if there was more discussions with folks who had lived experience of going through these kind of things, there would be a different outlook.
Well, that's what Schevers is
circumstantial,
about. Is Schevers wants to make a more welcoming kind of a space, an advocacy space, I guess, where so-called detransitioners or people who have re-identified can go and they can talk with each other without this harmful ideology all around it. But she also wants them to be able to say the stuff that we get angry about when they say it. That it was patriarchy that made a young girl think that they were a trans man. Now and I think that's, if you think that's your narrative, you need to be able to say it. It's just when it's weaponized the way it is.
Exactly, and it shouldn't be weaponized the way it is. So. And that's all we really have time for today. So thank you so much, Bette, I love a good info dump from Bette, and I'm really appreciative of your knowledge and your passion for these kind of things. It's honestly amazing. And I think you're an incredible advocate, and keep on going. I'm looking forward to working with you on here again soon, hopefully. Yeah. And so I'm going to end the show with a song about
trans kids.
About trans kids, the incredible Bette Noir, is that correct?
Bette Noir.
Bette.
One word, Bette Noir.
My letters got confused. Bette Noir. I can't even say that. You take it away from me, Bette.
This is Kids Are Alright by Bette Noir.
It's Bette Noir, here to talk about trans kids. So we all know the kids are alright. Am I right?
Thank you so much for listening to Transmission. See you next Tuesday, 9 to 10 a.m. on 4ZZZ.